Hello, this is my forensic social work presentation with a specific focus on juvenile justice and mass incarceration. My name is Kiara Branch. This is for North Carolina Central University School of Social Work Department, Professor Valentine, with the due date of 11/16/2020. Getting right into this next slide, which I have here is the introduction. Um, so overall, in my introduction of my paper, I discussed juvenile delinquency and mass incarceration and also going into the estimation of 2,714,000 juveniles under the age of 18 being arrested since 1994. And approximately over 60% of these behaviors consisted of status offenses, in which we know status offenses to be drug abuse, disorderly conduct, running away from home, smoking cigarettes, underage drinking, things of that sort. Also, 16% of all violent crime arrests and 26 of property crime arrests have occurred as of 2007, which is also significant because we know, which I also presented in my paper, that of the 2.5 million juveniles who are arrested annually, there's an estimation that 1.6 million cases, and cases being juveniles, have been found to be associated with habitual relapse offenses, which we also know to be reoffending or recidivism. I also discussed, yes, again, about the 1.6 million cases being associated with habitual and relapsed offenses. But just overall discussing and talking about that and as we can see from the statistics, there's an overwhelming amount of immediate attention that's needed to the concerns of juveniles and their direct correlation with mass incarceration. And we also know to be the school to prison pipeline, labeling, and all of that good stuff, and which I also talk about in my paper. And so for a little bit of the history, what I discussed was in the construction of the ruling class, and I'll discuss that a little bit. The existing society needed boundaries in which they could not control the efforts of lawmaking and breaking. And so when I discussed in my paper the construction of the ruling class, I was referring to what we know to be this imaginary hierarchy where people or society as a whole has, according to conflict theory, allowed people to create this foundation where there's a representation of a system that oppresses people socially according to dominant groups, which allows the manifestation of privilege. And by that meaning that some people are either born into this privilege or not born into this privilege. But either way, people feel as though one has to be one step, if you will, or higher up than the other person, which in return creates friction, and it allows for crime to be generated because people ultimately want to be at the top of this hierarchy. And so conflict theory talks about, again, that it can be seen as a foundation to not only juvenile offending, but to all crime acts that lead to mass incarceration of vulnerable populations such as children. And then additionally, it represents a system, again, of oppression that was put into place for socially dominant groups to maintain personal identities and social control, which is an example of the music that we have children listening to nowadays, and also our social media accounts such as your Facebook and things like that, who present these ideologies of what a normal teenager's life should look like. And so that's what conflict theory discusses. So then I also go into talking about labeling theory, and how children are typically this is kind of associated with the school to prison pipeline when children are, let's say, labeled the bad child in school, and this initially follows them up into early adulthood, where they are pretty much harassed, and they're very much known for being the bad person at this point and not just that once bad child. Um, and then I went on to talk about some of the strengths and perspectives of some of these ideologies. And so, conflict theory being again proposing the idea that law is utilized to keep and maintain social order. Um, in society, so that people are able to maintain this imaginary capitalistic hierarchy where, quite honestly, we have Black women at the bottom, um, and we have our Black men, we have our, no, I take that back, excuse me, we have our Black women at the bottom, we have our white women at the next level, and we would have our Black men and our white um, women, which was your basic capitalistic hierarchy. However, there has been other populations who have been added to this particular hierarchy, where we have our LGBT communities now. Um, we have our religious communities, but just speaking generally, basically, on this imaginary capitalistic hierarchy, again, we have our Black women at the very bottom and our white men at the top. But of course, we have our vice president, who is now a Afro-American woman, if you will, who may change that perspective. Um, but again, before youth are even born into this economic society, they are economically classified according to wherever their parents are in this hierarchy, which is automatically putting them at either an advantage or disadvantage, which is that privilege and non-privilege within the American system. And so that is a little bit of what I talked about, also in the strengths perspective. I discussed that this hierarchy is also a control system that generates retaliation amongst different cultures and populations, where it initially allows youth to act defensively. Um, Also, within this capitalistic hierarchy, much of the conflict within these different social groups come from the underlying proposition that the closer that one is to this conceptualized identity of dominance, right, where I just discussed that the white man being at the top ultimately means that you're winning, right? And so the closer that one is to this conceptualized identity, um, the more that he or she becomes closer to wanting money and power, which ultimately, um, if one doesn't have the means of affording these materialistic items, they result to deviance by any means necessary, which again means, I don't know if that means robbing, I don't know if that means trying to fit in with a class of people who they may not really are economically associated with. And so in return, that can cause bullying, which is another form of crime, specifically speaking on cyberbullying and crimes. Um, and what else did I talk about in my um, in the strengths perspective? Um, I also talked about how society has brainwashed children to believe that there is a need to be in constant competition with each other, in hopes, again, of being at this imaginary hierarchy. And so that these same ideologies that are passed on to youth ultimately gives them a reason to want to commit crimes. And so there's a fight to want to be better and to want to oppress, because if people are oppressed, then that means that no one is pretty much getting ahead. Um, and ultimately, if no one's getting ahead, then that just keeps generating that cycle because people are going to want to, if you will, get out of this cycle so that they can get ahead and not be oppressed. Um, and then I talked about how the great work of the conflict theory and the way that it works was influenced by Karl Marx. And he was a German philosopher. He was an economist, a social scientist who believed that the wealthy controlled the means of mass production and business, which were also known as the bourgeoisie. Um, he also focused on the fact that people from the lower class are arrested much more and charged with crimes. So this might look like your minority groups, such as your Hispanics, your Blacks, specifically your youth population who are easily targeted because they don't know their rights. Um, and then to that effect, the laws tend to favor in such a way that benefits those of the rich and powerful, leaving the powerless to suffer in consequence because ultimately they don't have the money to get out of the epidemic of mass incarceration. And so, with the assistance of former President Barack Obama, he came up with the Fair Sentencing Act that decreased this disparity, um, so that um, he decreased this disparity to 1 to 18, which in which this statistic was much higher before he generated this Fair Sentencing Act. I also talked about how the juvenile justice system uses a different set of terminology compared to the adult criminal justice system. And again, that is supposed to hinder that labeling theory. But however, the labeling theory suggests that when society places labels on juvenile offenders, it places a stigma leading, again, to that perception of a negative self-image. And so when youth are labeled as bad or other labels that deter from positive sanctions, these individuals tend to be treated and continue to be treated in a deviant manner. And so at this point, it's like they don't have control, and this ultimately is what is leading to mass incarceration when they don't have people like us as social workers or legal professionals to assist in navigating them through the justice system and knowing their rights. Um, Also, I discussed the learning theory, that kind of talks about how some youth may be in environments where crime is more likely to be rewarded and less likely to be a punished behavior. And so some of those positive reinforcements of being in this particular environment and learning the rewards may look like fast money. And this fast money creates a state of euphoria where it's like, well, I'm getting fast money, so I don't really see the purpose in needing to get a job. The adrenaline to getting the fast money um, is much higher. Some of the positive reinforcements may look like fast money, a state of euphoria from drug use, attention, peer pressure, or even an increased social or economical status, in which, if we talked about in the beginning, some children are automatically born at a disadvantage. And so if they can get that one up, this is their way to do it. And so this is why the environment in which we cultivate for children is a huge influence on the theory of crime and juvenile delinquency, as well as mass incarceration for juveniles. I also talked about some current trends and research. Um, I talked about policy implications within some of the theories that I just discussed, being um, that of a way to dismantle the structure of this imaginary American dream capitalistic hierarchy where children and people don't feel the need to be oppressed and be competitive with regards to achieving the American dream and being at the top of this capitalistic hierarchy. Um, I also talked about the most effective way to dismantling these ideologies are through restoration and restorative justice, specifically with restorative justice, combining the goals of seeking justice for the victim and the community, and just allowing people to pay their debt to society and be done with their punishment. Um, and specifically speaking about, you know, if people or if children are, I don't know, doing community service, or if they are being punished, specifically letting them do the punishment and be done, not having to be looked at as someone walking down the street, being labeled that, you know, they're a quite frequent child who has come in contact with the juvenile justice system, or their parents are well known for being in the criminal justice system. So just not allowing them to fall victim to the justice system. Also talked about rehabilitation and being able to reintegrate juveniles back into society in a more positive aspect, just allowing them to understand that just because they have come in contact with the justice system, or that they know someone who's come in contact with the justice system, that this does not always end bad, and that it doesn't have to follow them on into early adulthood. Um, Also talked about these specific steps could be seen as steps to dismantle the abuse of power by upper class social groups who make the laws to oppress social classes. So people or individuals who are of this economic status, or at this at the top of this capitalistic hierarchy, just not being able to always be in power. For example, we have our vice president, um, a Black woman. She's in a position of power and she's able to listen to us, and we're able to provide her feedback, you know, relatively to people of our complexion, of our color, just feeling like we have someone who looks like us to be able to represent us. So that is a step. Um, Also, I talked about the former condition and place of society would not be oppressive, thus leaving all people equal and not feeling the need to compete for privilege. And again, that's relative to being able to put people in a position of power who look like us and who can make decisions that are relative to people who look like us and who are in our class status, or even if they're no longer in this class status, they understand what it means to be in this particular economic status, or even this particular skin color.